Hello, welcome to Podfic Galore. I'm your horrible online reader, Goldscythe. I read out loud fanfictions for you busy bees, free of charge and no strings attached. Today I will continue reading the Silmarillion fic by Aeolian Sands from Archive of Our Own called The Rescue Party, Chapter 8. I hope you can at least try to enjoy my voice, and I will try my best for you with the equipment available to me. On with the show! The Rescue Party, Chapter 8. The Deep, Part 1. Fëanor sprinted down the shore-faced slope, his brothers a few steps behind him on either side. Every step brought them deeper and deeper into the dark waters, until not even the bright light of Varda's stars and Thelion could reach them in the murky depths. The only thing that kept elves from tripping and hurtling down the slope heads over heels was the impossible glowing light of the Hrar. Even with the mysterious glow to ward away the blackness of the deep waters, the inevitable soon happened. From behind Fëanor came a yelp and a sound of a body hitting the sand. Fëanor risked a fast glance over his shoulder to see Finarfin sliding down the slope on his back, desperately trying to stop himself. But the slope was too steep and the sand too firm, and Fëanor bit back a shout as Finarfin's body collided with his legs, sweeping him off his feet. The eldest son of Finwë hit the ground hard and tumbled, rolling in a tangle of limbs with far too much momentum. Fëanor's thoughts were a blur as his body flipped and he saw water, then sand, over and over. The world spun faster and faster, and he felt more and more bruises form when suddenly there was a thud as he hit something. A curse from Fingolfin followed, and Fëanor glimpsed his brother slamming hard into the ground before his vision was filled with sand again. Despite his own out-of-control fall down into the deeper parts of the sea, Fëanor still smirked. Fingolfin was not as sure-footed as he liked to claim. Cliff! Finarfin's voice pierced through the blackness, but Fëanor was still rolling. He never did see the edge, not even after he tumbled off of it. Iron hells! Fëanor mumbled, as at once he was falling through water. He tried to swim up, but Osse's magic was far too strong, and gravity won the day. He hurled into the deep like an anchor. Finarfin, who had been sliding on his back as opposed to rolling like his brothers, had valiantly attempted to steer away from the cliff's sheer drop, or to otherwise stop his downward descent. He was sure he had no skin left on his hand from his attempts to slow himself, and the remnants of his favorite white robe were torn to shreds on his back by the abrasive sand. He gritted his teeth and blocked the pain from being sandpapered alive as he twisted, seeing a snarl of kelp-like plants growing on the cliff's edge. Digging his hip into the sand was agony, but it gave him enough leverage to send him on a direct course for the tall, leafy weeds. He careened into them and grabbed at the stalks with flailing limbs. The vines responded by wrapping around him almost greedily and arresting his fall. Finarfin twisted in their grip to see his older brothers fly off the edge. No! He cried in vain as his heart rate tripled. They will not survive such a fall. Panic and something primal gripped his heart. Twisting frantically, Finarfin of Valinor violently tore through his own fare, pulling every fibre of his being to his will. The song that tore from his throat reverberated through the sea, bouncing off cliffs and dark places never seen by the eyes of man or elf. The entire sea still and shook under the power of his voice. On hearing such a desperate cry, the entangling plants that ensnared him let go as if burned, and Fëanor and Fingolfin found their fatal fall slowed to a glide as if some power from on high had come to save them. They both hit the depths of the ocean with no greater injury, and looked at each other in awe as their brother's voice echoed from the tall canyon wall surrounding them. The weeds of the cliff face and the rocks beneath them were not the only things that heard such a cry of power and despair. So too did the creatures of the deep. So too did Uinen, the Meyer of the shallow seas, where she rested near Egalrest. Sauron, in his newly claimed Tol in Gauroth, looked down the river with curiosity in his golden eyes. And 3 elf maids and 1 unhappy Maya in a rowboat far above them heard its echo through the waves. Ora, Erwan whispered, and she turned to Osse. Faster, my lord, Nernal commanded. The lights were going that way. She pointed further out to the sea. And while I can see them no longer, I hear the waves crying out in the voice of my king and friend. There are a great many things I currently don't understand, but those were no seal pups you were hoping to rescue. Another finished for her. Though, truthfully, Osse, you did not have to make them glow like that. They tend to set things on fire all by themselves. I didn't make them glow, Osse defended himself. So you did meet them? Eero encountered. Not that it matters. I recognize my husband's voice, though I've never heard it like that. Osse sighed. Yes, I met them. I was going to help them cross the sea. Can't you see they do not belong in Valinor? Your children are alone fighting a great war. Nerdanel's eyes glimmered. Yes, but they are fools to think that we would let them face danger alone. We already made that mistake once. Osse's eyebrows raised as he gazed upon the Eleth with the blazing red hair and claymore strapped to her back. Then he smiled to himself and swiftly propelled the boat forward. Fëanor found himself laying on his stomach in the blackness of the deep. The waters were still and stagnant around him, and he felt as if he had left the circles of the world altogether. Warily, he stood to his feet, his body casting that eerie glow around him. He saw Fingolfin in the process of standing as well, and noted how shredded his brother's clothes were from the fall. Looking down, Fëanor realized that his own were also in tatters. Altogether, they looked like vagabond spirits from the other world. Was that Ara? Fingolfin asked wearily, his hair fanning out behind him as he came to stand by Fëanor's side. Fëanor could only nod. There could be no denying that the voice had been their brother's, and the echo of its song-like cry still rang in the surrounding rocks. How could... Fingolfin began, but he never finished. There was a crack and a groaning from the darkness. Then a crackle like the arc of lightning. Something flashed from beyond. Fëanor was 1,000 times thankful he remembered to grab swords from the forge. He reached down to unsheath his blade, only for his heart to drop. His hand grasped water. There was no sword hilt. Blindly he swept again for a weapon. But still all he felt were cold waters. Looking down, he saw in alarm that his sword must have been wrenched from him in the tumble down the slope. In fact, his entire belt was missing, and the rags of his robe hung open from his shoulders. Nolo, he began, but he was interrupted by another arc of electricity as something charged them from the deep. Nolo, get down! Fingolfin ordered as he brandished his own sword, shoving Fëanor in the direction of the cliff face. A great eel, with lightning-like arcs of blue electricity dancing around it, charged at them from the inky blackness. Fëanor whipped his head around to see Fingolfin run straight towards it, naked blade raised in challenge. Adrenaline pumped through Fingolfin's veins as he charged the black creature. It was snake-like, but monstrous in its size, as large as Glaurung the dragon. The eel turned its great head when he saw Fingolfin run at him, sword naked and glinting in his light. It screeched horribly, and the electric charge of its body seemed to intensify. Then it reared back and opened its mouth, a bolt of pure blue energy arcing from its gaping maw to the elf. Fëanor shouted in warning, but Fingolfin was already leaping to the side, barely dodging the bolt as it slammed into the cliff face. The rocks groaned, and from high above them several broke loose and rained down into the darkness. Fingolfin dearly wished for his shield then, but having only one sword, he abandoned his charge and instead leapt backwards to the wall for protection. He landed next to his elder brother as both of them stood with their backs to the cliff. The eel barely seemed to notice the rocks at all, instead eyeing the elves as its body fluttered in place like a black ribbon. "Trying to get it to eat me instead?" Fëanor hissed from his side. "Well, if it's the only thing you are good for, then why not?" Fingolfin whispered through clenched teeth as his mind raced. But Fëanor did not have time to respond as the serpent charged them both. The two Noldor dove to opposite sides and the creature slammed its skull into the base of the cliff. The rocks groaned and Fingolfin heard a horrible, ear-splitting cracking noise as part of the cliff gave away beyond him and further into the deep. The unmistakable sound of earth giving way and rocks tumbling echoed through the water. "Landslide." Fingolfin spun on his heel in alarm, Run, you fool! He yelled at Fëanor as he raced across the mud of the deep. He grabbed his brother by the arms and they raced south as great pillows of sediment erupted behind them. The mud was oozing at their feet, threatening to trap them, but they paid no heed as the earth erupted behind them. Looking over his shoulder, Fingolfin saw an image that would forever haunt his nightmares. The great eel was racing after them, its body contorting in a side-to-side dance, and beyond was a plume of rock and sediment that in moments would bury both elves and a dark creature alive. And then he had a truly stupid idea. But it seemed like the only option. "Nada!" he yelled. "Lightning! Always goes to the ground, right?" He yelped despite breathing heavily from the exertion of sprinting for his life. "What? Just answer! Yes! But that creature will still shock you, idiot! What happens then? Paralyzation? Death?" Fingolfin looked back and knew they were not running fast enough. Already the smaller stones and a few boulders were upon them. He heard a yelp and a cracking sound at his side. Fëanor stumbled. Fingolfin didn't think. He grabbed Fëanor's wrist in one hand, his sword in the other, and when the dark creature was about to overtake them, he leapt onto a tumbling boulder and then up above the eel, stabbing it in the back with his blade. Instantly, pain flashed through every cell of his body. His hands locked around both the sword hilt and Fëanor's wrist so that he couldn't release his grip if he tried. They trailed behind the eel like a flag at the top of a sailing ship's mast. Fingolfin only prayed that their position above the eel, combined with whatever magic of Osse that made the waters around them feel like air, would protect them from the bulk of the charge and save them from seeing Mundus again. But his arms and legs were numb, and he wondered if anyone would find their bodies. Finarfin lay on the sand as he forced himself back from the brief spell of unconsciousness. He must have fainted after trying to save his brothers. The earth beneath him was trembling as if an earthquake, and he stared at the cliff before him to see a plume of fine sediment erupting from below. Oh no. And the water around him was stained red. Finarfin looked down and saw that his hands were bleeding, and he assumed that his back was a little better. Strange how he did not feel any pain. He wondered if he was in shock. But he had little time to think much more about his current condition, because the water around him was tainted with his blood, and the earth below him shook. And he had a terrible feeling of being haunted. Tearing a ragged strip of his thoroughly ruined clothing from his body, he rubbed his hands quickly and then pulled a dagger from his boot, cursing himself for going after Fëanor without a sword. He crouched in a ready stance when he saw before him a pair of blinking lights. Then another. And another. And all around him twin lights blinked on in the darkness. The Elf King adjusted his grip on his dagger. Eyes. They were eyes. Dozens of eyes peering at him in the darkness. And then the still waters moved, and there were flashes of brilliance as the creatures before him lit up in a light of their own making. And Finarfin saw that he was surrounded by stinging tentacles of jellyfish-like creatures. These were greater in size than the shallow sea creatures he had known. On their glistening caps were eyes like those of a spider, and they all were trained on him as a swarm of the creatures surrounded him, the ribbons of blood in the water reaching out to them.
"Eating little elfling, delicious, delicious,"
one of the creatures creaked, and then the net closed. The tentacles reached out at him to grab his wrists and ankles, but Finarfin slashed at them with his knife. A terrible screech filled the waters as Finarfin sliced through some spidery threads, while simultaneously leaping to keep his legs free, but his efforts were in vain. The creatures surrounded him like a curtain on all sides, and there was no hope of defense with so many encircling, stinging ropes. And he sliced one away from his neck, another reached for his foot, and lashed around his ankle like a balrog's whip. Finarfin shouted as the stinging barbs found their purchase, but he struggled still, kicking out with his free leg and with his dagger. But then a creature charged and latched itself to his stomach, and Finarfin felt pain flare through his body as it stung him mercilessly. He attempted to slash it off, but another set of tentacles wrapped around his wrist, and the shock of its paralyzing sting forced him to drop the dagger. The world became blacker, and he found that he could no longer will his body to move. His last thought was of a fly caught in the spider's web. Osse stopped the boat, his face pale. Closing his eyes, he dropped a hand in the water. Your husbands are down there in the deep, where dark primordial evil still dwells. What do you mean, primordial? Anara asked. Like Ungoliant the Great Spider, there were some inhabitants of the void that were not Ainur. Eru may know of their beginnings, but I certainly do not. A few came with us to Ea and dwelled in the dark places. Many found their home in the depths of the sea. And Fëanor down there, picking a fight with them? Nerdanel questioned, standing up. Osse swirled his hand around in the water. Yes. Fëanor and Olafinwe are to the south. Olafinwe directly below us. They must have gotten separated. But all three are gravely injured. Nerdanel wanted to slap the Meyer. Of course they were injured. Whose great idea was it to give Fëanor access to the primeval deep? Let us go to them. What? You heard me, Nerdanel demanded. Whatever powers you give to them to breathe the water, give to us. You owe us that much for making the situation so much worse. Osse's eyes flared, but he did as demanded, his hand momentarily glowing with power. There. You will be able to breathe and walk in the sea. I shall also bless your descent so it's slow. Anaire and Nerdanel, you want to jump over the starboard side here and dive at an angle. Follow the undersea canyon south when you see it. Erwan, just let yourself fall straight down. Nerdanel nodded and reached for the bow of the boat, undoing the Fëanorian lamp that hung there. Erwan, let her silver-haired friend put her hand up. I will be all right without a lamp. My quarry apparently was smart enough not to run any further. Nerdanel nodded and then gave Osse a slight bow. You aren't coming? Osse seemed to grimace. Something tells me I need to stay out of the water for a moment, but hurry now. There's no time for talk. And Nerdanel nodded again, taking a deep breath and diving into the sea, angling towards the south. Anara followed her, but Erwan let herself fall straight down. Erwan saw a glowing mass below her, but could not make out what it was until her feet touched the sand and she landed gracefully on the seafloor. Looking at the light before her, a terrible sight greeted her fair eyes. Finarfin hung unmoving in a tangled web of wispy strands, 4 or 5 unnaturally large jellyfish with countless eyes holding him trapped just above the seafloor. A cry of rage escaped her throat, and she sprinted across the sand, her trident in hand. The creatures had so enwrapped themselves around Finarfin's body that they did not have time to react. Like a war maiden of legend, she leapt and stabbed one of the creatures in the cap with the prongs of her trident. In a great heave, she threw it over his shoulder where the body flung off the trident and spiraled in the deep. Finarfin awaking to cry in shocked pain as the pronged tentacles ripped from his arm. But Erwan did not allow that to distract her. She plunged her weapon into another of the creatures and kept driving it forward until she had pierced 2. They wailed in a terrible screech as her weapon ended them. Flinging them again free from the trident's prongs, she spun in water, her long silver hair following her. Only 2 remained, one ensnaring Finarfin's legs and another at his neck. The one at his legs let go and charged her. But Erwan was swift of foot and dodged it, spinning to lance it from behind.
Failed you have.
The last one creaked from where it held her husband by the throat.
Kill me and you will kill your prize too. And they taste better alive.
But Erwan winded up her arm and threw the great weapon, spearing the dark thing through its eyes and pinning its lifeless body to the seafloor directly behind it. Erwan approached her husband then, and saw that his eyes were open and seeing, although he made no attempt to get up or to free himself from the strands that still encircled his throat. Erwan knelt down, and bracing herself, pried the tentacles off of him as gently as she could, ignoring their sting and shock. Finarfin would never forget, in life or death, this world or the next, the vision that came to him in those dark moments. As his body lost feeling, and he found himself unable to move or fight off the tangled, poisoned web, he waited for the call of Mondos. But Mondos did not come for him. Never Mondos. It was not one of the Valar before him, fighting off the creatures with great war trident and spearing them with rage and fury only known in myth, for not even Varda could look so beautiful or fight with such deadly grace. It was Eärwen. Eärwen with the gleaming silver hair as she danced like a nymph of the seas and single-handedly defeated the foes that he thought had already slain him. Eärwen, who pulled the last of the clawing ropes from his neck and pillowed his head into her lap. "You are stunningly beautiful," he whispered, as at once the pain from all that he endured crashed upon him. "Shush," Eärwen said as she pulled him closer. "I am still mad at you," she said, but the gentle arms around his body told him the truth. "I'm all right," he insisted, although he knew it to be a lie. "Nolo? You are not all right. You cannot even move," Eärwen whispered. Finarfin frowned, because it was true. Before he could come up with a response, Eärwen had gathered him into her arms and stood. The movement was enough to send darkness spiraling down into his vision. End of Chapter 8, Part 1. Stay tuned.